Good morning. We still have a few minutes before we start, but while you get ready, if you're already tuned in, we will be in Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 to 14. So if you go there, we have about 2 minutes and we'll start. All right, we have just about a minute, and once again, we're in Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 to 14. So in just about a minute, we'll go ahead and begin. All right, we're just about ready to begin. So once again, Daniel 7, verses 1 to 14. And this week, as we look at this, I'd like to have the whole thing look at the question, who is in charge? Because that's a lot of times the question we ask. Okay. And with the who's in charge is because the world can be a pretty scary place sometimes. And so who is in charge of everything, and is anything out of control? And so the answer is God is still in charge of everything, and no, nothing is out of control. So when we look at this the verses today, what we're going to see is a vision that Daniel received. And so a little bit about a vision. A vision is a means of receiving a message from God. Interpreting a vision provides meaning to the message. Sometimes the interpretation is very specific. Other times it remains vague. A vision is also a witness about God's message, since it's received by specific people at a specific time. So sometimes when we see visions, we see that they relate to a specific person, maybe a king, and they also talk about the immediate future, what is about to unfold. And so with that, the other part, sometimes the vision is exactly explained. And we've seen that earlier with when the king not only wanted the vision explained, the dream that he had, but he also wanted you to tell him what the dream was. He wasn't going to give even what the dream was. So to interpret it, since it's a message from God, would require God to give the interpretation to somebody. And in this case, it's going to be Daniel. And so, like we said, sometimes visions are exact. Sometimes they are not exactly explained. They may be vague about the timeline of events. And so that's what we see in both the Old and New Testament. Anything dealing with the end and the coming judgment is talked about to show that God is in control and a series of events will happen and the series of events will get bad, but they're not specific. They're not specific so that you can say, wow, on this date and this time, it's all going to come to an end, or on this date and this time, the end is going to start. But they're vague on purpose, but they're specific enough for us to know that God is controlling the end. And they show what God will do when the time occurs. And this is a big one for us. They serve as a source of comfort, knowing that no matter the trials or events that are occurring, God has given us a message beforehand on how he controls everything, including the end. So that should be comforting, and it is comforting because we know no matter what is going on, it didn't mess up God's plan. It didn't surprise God, and it's still going in accordance with everything that God has said that would happen, and that's why it's intentionally vague so that we don't know exact when does the end start and when does the end actually occur. So with that, that's because the other visions Daniel's had, some of them are very specific, and the exact interpretation of the dream or vision has occurred. Here is going to be a little different. So some background. Around 533 BC, during King Belshazzar of Babylon's first rule, Daniel had a vision that he wrote down, and we'll see that in verse 1. The vision was the first of 4 visions that Daniel has. The visions highlight God's sovereignty, like we said, over the nation. So when he sees the visions, and we will end before he gets the meaning, and starting in verse 15, but the visions are of a future time, not of an exact event time that's given to him. So as we look at it, then we're going to cover what he saw and what we believe they mean, and also the fact that Daniel, when he received it, it wasn't a message to the king, because visions, not only do they have a message, but they have an intended audience. So for the king, then he explained the king's dream, his vision, and the meaning. So we know that, okay, the audience, the intended person was the king, and Daniel was the means of talking to the king, because God had given Daniel the interpretation of what did the vision mean. So here what we're going to see is who is the audience, who is the intended recipient. And I would say everyone that's had the Old Testament and the current New Testament is the intended recipient, because we are the ones that are approaching the end. Now, I don't know that the end is approaching. By all means, I don't have any insight, but I'm saying ever since Christ ascended, the countdown to the end has been on. And so that, the countdown from the end was on when this was written, because the end was known by God. But especially today, we know, okay, Christ has come, he ascended, and so we know, okay, we must be even closer to the end, of course, than Daniel was. So when we look at verse 1, we see in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon. So that's kind of a timestamp for us. And it identifies a general time period, but not a specific date. So we know basically when he's getting this vision. Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind as he was laying in bed. So we know a little bit about the events and how Daniel received them. And then he says he wrote down the dream, and here is a summary of the account. So that is a really, so he wrote it down so that it would be it eventually became part of the Old Testament, and of course, part of the Bible today. But the message wasn't just for him. It wasn't a This is what's going to happen, Daniel, during your lifetime. It was a vision of how, now remember, Daniel's in some trying times. He's been taken off in captivity. He's led his whole life in captivity. And so this also is to reassure Daniel that God is in control. This is all part of God's plan. All of it's going to unfold just as God has planned. And even in Daniel's time, it was unfolding that way. Even in our time, it was unfolding. So that summary of the account is important to us today. In verse 2, Daniel said, "In my vision at night, I was watching," and now the word suddenly, we're going to keep track of the word suddenly just in the first 14 verses. That's going to come up 7 times. And so when we think about suddenly, we think about events that we didn't foresee and that happened immediately. And so an easy one today is getting in a car wreck. So there I am driving down the road and suddenly I'm struck by another car. And so it's that type of unplanned. It just happened so quickly and we weren't expecting it. So now we're going to have these 7 suddenlies that it will occur. So he says, "I was watching, and suddenly the 4 winds of heaven stirred up the great sea." Now, that understanding is that the sea represents the stirring of God's purpose. So now we know, okay, God's purpose has been stirred, and there's something that's about to happen. 4 huge beasts came from the sea, each different from one another. And so now, we have these 4 beasts, and as we're going to get a description of them, we're going to see the word like. And so people who saw visions from God often use the word like, and we can see that in chapter 7, 5, 6, and 8 that we're going through. We also see it in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 5, and we also see it in Revelation 13:2. And the word like is because if you see something and no one else has saw it, you're the only one who saw it, and these beasts that he sees, no one has ever seen one. And so he's left trying to describe it to the rest of us on what do these look like. So when he says, well, they look like, he's trying to give us a representation that we will understand because he saw them in the dream. And now he's trying to relay to us, well, it was like, and that's what we're going to see. He says, the first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. And so that is something that, we don't see. It's not in nature. So he's describing to us what he saw. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground and set on its feet like a man, and was given a human mind. So as we look at this, interpreters understand the lion as the kingdom of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. A lion was a powerful animal, and Babylon was a powerful empire. The eagle's wings probably, now, when we talk about what this probably means, what it appears to mean, that is because when you get to verses starting at 15 through the rest of the chapter, it's not the explicit that we like to have. It's still the general explanation. So Daniel never received an explicit, this is exactly what it means, this is who it was, this is when it will occur, this is, that was not received. So back to, it's understood, though, that the lion was a powerful animal, and Babylon was a powerful empire. The eagle's wings probably denote great sovereignty over a large area, but the clipping of its wings likely refers to Nebuchadnezzar's humbling in chapter 4, 28 to 37, and perhaps Belshazzar's in 5, 13 to 30. And so the second, in verse 5, the second suddenly another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. And so Once again, most interpreters believe the bear represented the Persian Empire and sometimes called Medo-Persia. Persia was the dominant part of the kingdom, which may have been the reason the bear was raised up on one side. And then they also suggest that the three ribs allude to Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia, three major conquests of the Persians. So it was raised up on one side with three ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up, gorge yourself on flesh. So that's a pretty big command, and that is the type of action it's going to do. And the gorging itself on flesh, just like it sounds like it is devouring. It is going out to devour. After this, while I was watching, now we have number 3, suddenly another beast appeared. It was a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. So again, we have that it was like, because he's trying to describe something he saw in a vision, but what he saw, no one's ever seen before. So he can only describe it as like, it was like this. Now, most interpreters believe this is the Greek Empire Alexander the Great was established. The 4 wings and the 4 heads likely describe the 4 generals who divided Alexander's empire when Alexander died. So the comment is, people should not place their ultimate hope in kingdoms or rulers of the earth. The beast Daniel saw frightened him, yet they only rule by God's authority, and we should respect our leaders, but also recognize God guides them whether they realize it or not. And that's in Romans 13, 1-7. So it says it had 4 heads and was given dominion. So when it says it was given dominion, what we have to remember is dominion was not the beast to take on its own. He did not inherently have dominion or rulership, nor could he take it. And so to say it was given dominion still goes back to God gave it dominion, God allowed it, but it did not take dominion and rule for a time away from God. So that's why we, when we know God is always in charge, we see that it was given dominion. It didn't just rise up. Because when we see, like when Daniel and we see these empires that rose, and we even in the world today, we see, all sorts of things going on between country, we sometimes think that they're doing it solely because of their own might. They have grown big, they've grown powerful, they have weapons, they have all of these things. But even in ancient times, countries were destroying other countries and taking the people back as slaves. But they weren't able to do it then because they didn't have inherent power to do something that God did not allow. And here we see it with that given dominion. So that's something important to remember even today. In verse 7, after this, while I was watching in the night vision, now we hit number 4, suddenly a 4th beast appeared, frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong. So now we have a little different. Now the other beasts are pretty bad, right? They're get up and gorge yourself on flesh. We see the description, and yet this beast that just came up, the 4th beast, is worse than all the rest. And that's why we have a description that doesn't occur in the other 3. The description is frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong with large iron teeth. And so, when we think about teeth and we see animals' teeth, yes, they're big, yes, they're strong. However, at some point, even a lion will crack a tooth off, right? If there's enough problem. Or if you've ever cracked a tooth, teeth are really strong and you use them for a long time, but they're just not indestructible. So here we're getting a description of it's frightening, it's dreadful, it's incredibly strong with large iron teeth. And so large iron teeth for an animal, for being ferocious, would be really bad because the iron teeth are a symbol of the strength. They're not going to be affected by ripping somebody apart or attacking. So this fourth beast really gets a more descriptive, uh, a more description on how terrible it is. And with this description, it possessed a power to destroy that the other kingdoms did not. And it is dreadful and it's frightening. So it says it devoured and crushed, and it trampled with its feet whatever was left. So that trampling with its feet with whatever is left. So even if it destroyed another empire, if it just whatever it attacked and destroyed, even its feet destroyed the remains of what were left. And so this is a really horrible beast that is literally winning and destroying whatever it fights. And so most interpreters identify the fourth kingdom with the Roman Empire. Rome became a dominant empire in the 2nd century BC and surpassed the other empires with its superior administrative capability. Rome ruled the world at the time of Jesus' birth in Luke 2:1, and scholars have identified the beast's 10 horns with the 10 emperors of Rome. So in the next verse it says, it was different from all the other beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. So even though the other beasts are, we saw the description of things that, a lion with eagle's wings, and we see these other descriptions, this beast is still different from all of the other ones. While I was considering the 10 horns, number 5, suddenly another horn, a little horn, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. So with that, while he's considering the 3 horns and the other horn, the little one, came up, so powerful was the 11th horn's appearance that 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. Many scholars understand this little horn as the Antichrist, who in the last days will raise his voice against God and his people. And that's 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 and Revelations 13:1-10. So before we start looking further, with this vision encompasses a very large amount of time, a tremendous amount of time from where he is at, Daniel, in his time frame, and it spans very shortly all the way to the very end, we'll see. So what he's given a vision of is not the specifics of how it will end, but it's showing Daniel from where you're at right now all the way to the end, an animal representation of these empires and some representation on them of what will occur. And then when we see at the end what finally occurs. So Daniel is seeing this incredibly long view of time for the rest of mankind time. And so now the first horns were uprooted. 3 of the first horns were uprooted. And number 6, and suddenly in this horn there were eyes like the eyes of a human and a mouth that was speaking arrogantly. So that mouth that's speaking arrogantly, that is that's also a visual. It's got eyes, it's that horn's got a mouth, but it's only that final beast. And so the Bible affirms that God put leaders in their position of authority for the sake of the citizens they serve, and that's in 1 Peter 2:13-17. Nonetheless, God gives them authority to rule, and God can take it away. God gives grace to the humble, and he will empower humble leaders to serve him and their people effectively. So the whole, God is working with all empires, and all of them are going to be used for his plan. And even the empires that we're seeing here that are not aligned with God and God's desires, they are still being used, and we even see the word empowered. They're given dominion, they're given authority. And so, but the same way that God gives them authority for a time, it is limited. And then the authority goes, and it's rescinded, it's taken back. As I kept watching, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Now, this description of God appears nowhere else in the Bible. And so the Ancient of Days, as we're looking at titles of God, this is where it appears, is in Daniel. Now we have a description. His clothing was white as like snow, and the hair of his head like whitest wool. Now we've had a description of what Daniel saw, and now we're going to further see his throne was flaming fire. Its wheels were a blazing fire. A river of fire was flowing, coming out of his presence. So that is a description of what did it look like when he saw the Ancient of Days. God took the seat on his throne. So, and Daniel testifies that the river of fire was flowing, it was coming out of his presence. In the days of Moses, fire came out from God's presence and consumed the offering in Leviticus 9:24. So I really like that in Leviticus 9:24 also, because it talks about God has God sets the expectation for worship in the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's why we talk about when you become a Christian, then, and you're becoming Christ-like, you're a disciple learning about Christ, then there are some set things that occur, and then there's other things that are up to us. Do we meet at 9, 10, 11? Okay, that's not in the Bible. We choose that. Do we sing, have a service, a message, and sing, or how do we set that up? That's up to us. But one of the things that's not up to us in the New Testament is, do I come on Sunday and worship with a group of believers or not? That is not up to us. That is not something that we choose. When you make a decision to follow Christ once, and you should never have to decide if you're going to church again. If you made that decision to follow Christ, then you should never have to face the decision, do I go to church this morning or not? Because yes, you've already made that decision to follow Christ when you accepted salvation and were baptized. So that fire, back to the Leviticus, the fire also came from God's presence. Now that the fire came down and consumed the offering. There's a really great story there to read, and it talks about Moses, and it talks about the setting up the priesthood and offering a sacrifice in a very specific way. And so then to show that it was accepted, fire came down and consumed it. Now we have, however, fire also came down from God's presence to consume Nadab and Abihu, the two sons of Aaron's, who offered fire before the Lord in a manner that was not prescribed. And that's in Leviticus 10, 1-2. And so literally right after the priests are confirmed through the process that God had said, two of them are consumed. They're destroyed with fire because immediately they offered fire before the Lord in a manner not prescribed. So that's the story. And then you see his next two sons are raised into the priesthood. So God has a very specific way of worship, and it's not, and we see it in the Old Testament and the New Testament because God tells us, this is what I expect. So Paul described the coming judgment as a day of fire when believers' work that they did for themselves would be burned up, and only their works on behalf of God would remain. And that's 1 Corinthians 3, 10 to 15. So throughout the Bible, we have a vision of fire both purifying, and there's an idea that, when you make gold, for instance, and it heats up in a fire, then the dross, I think is pronounced right, the non-gold material is drained off, and then what is left has been purified by the fire. Here we see a river of fire flowing out of his presence. And so, so that imagery from the Old Testament and the New Testament about fire is also within his vision here of a river of fire flowing out. Now, the next part, thousands upon thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. So what he's seeing is an immense and almost immeasurable number of people to see in a vision. And so he's giving us an idea of what the thousands upon thousands that served him, and the 10,000 times 10,000 that stood before him. So that gives us an idea of the large, immense gathering that is here before God. And that immense gathering is important because of the next sentence. Now we're going to get some legal terminology. The court was convened and the books were opened. So now, in reading that, we know God has sat at his throne. He took his throne. And we see this immense multitude is before him. And then we have these legal terms. The court was convened. So when you convene a court, there's some sort of ruling coming out of it. And so when you convene that court, we know something is about to happen. And the books were opened. The books are a record. We even say, like, accountants keeping the books, right? So the books, they're a record. Even, if you have a library in your house, even a small library, those books are a record, if they're nonfiction, of something that has occurred. And that's what we see here. The court was convened and the books were opened. I watched then, because of the sound of the arrogant words the horn was speaking. Now that whatever that horn is speaking, they're able to hear. As I continued watching, the beast was killed. And so I'm going to read the whole sentence. The beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to the burning fire. So if indeed the horn represents the Antichrist, the verse describes the final judgment that occurs in Revelation 19:20. And so almost as he's watching, then the beast that had all of this dominion, all of this power, was a terrifying, was destroying, and with just by God willing, that was the end. The beast was killed. There is no battle. There's no battle description here. There was no effort. There was no battle. There was no resistance, because you could not resist the will of God. The beast was killed, its body destroyed, and given over to the fire. As for the rest of the beast, their dominion was removed, but an extension of life was granted to them for a certain period of time. So once again, even the other empires are not an empire on their own. And so we see their dominion, their ability to rule on what they ruled was removed, but an extension of life was granted. So that is, and this is what that we're talking on the notes, just the descendants of these empires existed, but did not rule as they once had. And so it's not a time that all of it has been destroyed. It's not that no empires exist. They cannot exist and rule as they once had. I continued watching, in the night visions. And number 7, suddenly. Now we have the 7th. Suddenly, these things are just, he's watching, and all of a sudden it all changes. Suddenly, one like a son of man was coming with the clouds in heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. Now, when we talk about this, the interpreters identify the Son of Man figure with Christ. And so the text does not reveal for sure whether Daniel was describing Jesus' first coming, second coming, millennial reign, or eternal reign. Because remember, we're seeing from the time of Daniel to the very end of time. So the purpose of the message we're seeing is to show that these empires are coming. They will rise, they will be powerful, they will do all sorts of things. And just as that 10 horn, the 11th horn, I think it was destroyed, and the other empire's dominion was taken away, all of that is because they were only allowed, not that they took power on their own. So with that kind of that vagueness, the text doesn't identify whether it's the first, second coming, millennial reign, or eternal reign. Jesus associated himself with this verse when he stood on trial before Caiaphas, the high priest, in Matthew 26:64. So we know that that is an important verse because Christ referenced it when he was before the high priest. And the high priest and those present, it says those present knew the scriptures and knew what Jesus was saying. They considered it blasphemy and condemned him to death in Matthew 26:65 and 66. So the understanding of what that verse meant, when Jesus said that to them, they knew what he was saying. And that they sentenced him to death for blasphemy because of what he said. That's the reason they used to sentence him to death. And then it says he approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. Now we're going to hear about this new empire. He was given dominion, and now see, some of the others were given dominion, but let's look at the whole thing. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. So in this new kingdom, not only did he receive dominion, he received glory. And that in that kingdom, he's given the kingdom with a purpose, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. So really, when we see the other kingdoms, one, they never had glory. And two, they didn't exist to give a nation, a kingdom, so that every people, that's everyone, every nation and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So this final kingdom that Daniel has this incredible vision of time that's compressed into a series of events that are portrayed as these fantastic beasts that he's seeing. And then he sees at the end the only nation that will exist is the one given to Christ, and that will have glory, and all of his people from every nation, every language will be there to serve him. And something else, his dominion is everlasting, and it will not pass away. Now, so that how long is everlasting? It's hard to say. We can't even comprehend what forever means. But that's how long it is. It's forever. It doesn't pass away. And His kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. And so not only will it be there forever, it is beyond the ability to have it destroyed. So, and then I want to say, before we get ready to close, I want to say verses 15 to 28. You're going, please read that, and you'll see it's a presentation on its meaning. However, even in a presentation of the meaning, that's why we talked in non-absolutes. This is what different scholars, this is what a consensus of, this is what we think it means, and this is what how it's understood. But even when Daniel gets the meaning in those other verses, it's still not specific, because just like in the Revelation, only God knows the time of the end. No one knows. And so even in Revelation, what we see is and we see it also in terms of some fantastic events and, through animals we've never seen, but we see the end times presented, and then we see what happens when the judgment happens. And that's where we see, that court was convened and the books were opened. And when the books are opened, now we're seeing all of this occur. So the message is not on a date. It's not on you have this many years left. The end won't occur until this exact person named whatever he is occurs. None of that. It's a message the same it was to Daniel. No matter what's going on, we're working to serve God, and only those things that we do for God will remain. Those things we do for ourselves won't. And don't doubt God. When we talk about faith, and we talk about faith in God, one of the aspects of faith is I don't have to know why things are bad right now. Because I have faith that even though it looks like it's pretty bad, God is in control. God never lost control. And so that faith is, no one owes me an explanation. I know God knows what he's doing, and how could I ever understand what he's doing? So I don't even try. I live in faith that all that occurs, all that is allowed to happen, is according to God's plan and will bring glory to God in the end. And so, without having to understand it, with that taken out of my life, and I don't have to know why things are happening, I'm left to just focus on, okay, I don't have to know why it's bad. What do I have to do? Oh, I have some really simple instructions when Christ left. Become disciples, create disciples, and reach the entire world with the gospel message. And we don't have to know why this country is rising up against that one. We don't have to, there's so much now that we don't have to know, that we just go, that's God's part. God's part is to control the universe and bring us to the end according to his plan. My part is only, who's the next person I'm going to talk to? Who is the next person I can be a witness to? And that's it. So Daniel has, we have one more session in Daniel, and as we read through Daniel, you have to remember too, you're reading through somebody's entire life. Last week we said he was about 80, and so we're watching and rapidly the whole presence of his life. But we see in the presence of of what we receive from Daniel, the message is always that, just like this story is, Daniel worried about, how do I serve God where I'm at? And I don't worry about the consequences, because the consequences are really if God allows it anyway. And so with that type of idea that I don't have to worry about what's going on, I have to worry about what I'm doing. We see Daniel prayed even though they put him in the lion's den. We see that he did it without concern for consequence, and God chose to save him. But his life reflects this. God, he knew the end. He knew how it's going to end. He, just like us, he doesn't know specifics and he doesn't know when. But through the whole problem, his entire focus was, how do I serve God while I'm here? And that's ours today. How do I serve God while I'm still here? So thank you all for coming this morning. And David, if I can have you close us.
Lord, we thank you so much for allowing us to be in your house this morning to study your word and to see that Daniel was given a description of what in the time that he was living in and the time to come would be like. We thank you that all we have to do is have faith in you, that you have control of it all, and that we allow you to control that and trust in you, and we don't have to worry about that. We just have to worry about being that witness for you that we need to be, to share when we can, and to lift us up when they're struggling with things. Just pray that you will be with us this morning as we go to worship service. Be with Brother John as he brings the message this morning. Just pray that you will be with Dale's family as they continue to mourn the loss of her. But we know she's in heaven with you from her witness and from her life's testimony that she had faith in you and that you were going to, you were her Savior and you were going to take her through. So we just pray that you will be with us this morning as we prepare to worship you. All these things ask in Jesus' name. Amen.